Okay, this is part 2 of the 3 sections for Chapter 7, Deviance and Social Control. We are going to resume on slide 8, and you should continue taking notes in your packet. Section 2 will end on slide 13. All right, so when a norm is important enough, it'll be formalized into law. The reason is to maintain the well-being of others, so criminal laws, or mores, like the prohibition of murder, are clearly necessary to provide a safe society for everybody. And civil laws reflect a current need in society. So, for example, laws on immigration have been established and continue to be amended and updated based on what's passed in elections and what's passed in Congress. Another hot topic right now, recreational use of marijuana, is currently a federal crime, yet it's recently, in 2012, election was legalized in both Colorado and in Washington. So you can see that they're always changing as people's values and opinions change. Some, of course, we can be safe to say will not, such as murder. The concept of control theory, to me, can be interpreted much the same as social control. So this term was theorized by an American sociologist named Travis Hershey in the 90s. And it basically asserts that because we hold so much value to the bonds that we have with our family, to the bonds we have with our friends, that we just follow these norms and folkways and laws. This is not, an end-all, be-all explanation for all acts of conformity, because of course you're going to find people who conform but have very, very weak or very little social ties. And then you'll also find that you have those with strong family and friend ties, and they just do not conform. But many of us can probably agree that we often do follow these rules because we just don't want to have to explain ourselves to our significant others or disappoint people in our lives. When we don't comply with the norm or the law, we are deviating, thus the term deviance. In your packet, at the very end, you will find a deviant behavior quiz. So I'm going to ask you to pause this recording and take the quiz, and then be sure to add up how many years you should be serving. Keep in mind, this is not something to feel guilty about, that everybody at some point in their life deviates. A couple additional points about deviance. One, it involves violation of group norms, and it doesn't necessarily mean that those norms are formalized into law. So consider your group of classmates a group who has a set of norms. You have expectations of each other. You have different routines and different behaviors that you consider acceptable and unacceptable. Let's say that you are amongst a group, unfortunately, who has established a set of norms in which you often cheat on homework and on quizzes. Now, if you decided to approach your instructor and inform them of that cheating, you would be deviating from your own group's norms. The second point is that social definition within a particular society at a particular time. So deviance and society's definition of it is always changing. For example, you might watch a show called Mad Men. It's a show that takes place in the 1960s at an advertising firm, and you find different behaviors in the workplace that you would never find now, including cigarette smoking. So because of the campaigns against cigarette smoking and the widespread knowledge of its harms to your health, cigarette smoking has become a deviant act. It is legal, but society does consider it to be deviant in the sense that it's frowned upon. You're no longer allowed to smoke in buildings, and even some cities have actually made it illegal to smoke in any public place within that city. So you can see that the social definition of deviance can change as society continues to grow and change and evolve. All right, much of the sentiment in society about deviant behavior is negative. That is, deviance is a stigma. And Irving Goffman, our guy who coined the dramaturgical effect, which we learned about in chapter 4, and also helped us to define total institutions, which we learned about in chapter 5, is also known for this use of the word stigma. When he uses this term, he's referring to it in the way in which groups can be labeled as deviant. So society often devalues members of certain groups and makes assumptions about them. So for example, teenage boys who are street dancers or break dancers. Let's say that you have a group of these boys who live in your neighborhood. They hang out on the corner and they practice their dance moves. One day you find your car's broken into, and you automatically assume that it's probably one of these boys. This is what Goffman meant in that some groups are stigmatized as deviant. Interestingly, technologies also redefine deviance. It's pretty easy to be anonymous online. You can make up a persona, you can pretend to be someone you're not. So you can think of some acts that people would do online and probably not do in person. And I'll let you use your imagination for that one. Not all acts are illegal, but definitely not entirely socially acceptable. There are also illegal uses of technology. You wouldn't go inside a Best Buy and run out with a bunch of CDs without paying for them. But I'm sure many of you out there have probably illegally downloaded movies, music, and video games. Somehow, the internet technology has made light of such illegal acts, and that's probably attributed to, at least in some part, to how faceless and anonymous the internet is for us. As we know, an interactionist is always interested in the day-to-day effects of a particular phenomenon to an individual or at the micro level. One particular example is the labeling perspective. Interactionists have many theories about deviant behavior, social control, but we're going to focus on the labeling theory for this particular chapter. The labeling theory is also known as the societal reaction approach. This basically says that it's not the actual behavior of the individuals in a group that determines deviance, but really it's the other people's, those outside the group. It's their response that labels them. For example, a child might have ADHD, and his or her teacher has determined him or her to be a troublemaker. And they've basically labeled them with that as troublemaker. The teacher will then treat the student as a troublemaker, and then eventually the student may even start to internalize that. And a more famous analogy, it's called The Saints and the Roughnecks, was based on research of high school students by a sociologist named William Chambly, and that was in 1973. And I have a little slideshow that I want you to just follow along. Okay, so these are the basic characteristics of the Saints and Roughnecks study. First of all, the groups Saints and Roughnecks were observed over 2 years, and the reinforcing point was the power of social class, so how those who were of middle and middle upper class were viewed versus those who were in lower classes. And these labels were not based on behavior, and you'll see that through the next couple slides. So the group that was labeled as the Saints, these were boys that would go to school but would be worried about trying to get out of school early. They were always looking for ways to get out of class and were very clever and calculated about that. Once they were out of class, they would just roam around town and kind of just try to be inconspicuous and blend in. On the weekends, the Saints would travel into town, they would drink, they would vandalize, and they would drive after drinking and pull pranks on people, generally just kind of get into trouble. In those 2 years that they were being observed, they were stopped twice by the police. In school, the Saints were successful academically. They were popular. They were the jocks. They were the ASB president, vice president, but they cheated on exams and they were blatantly truant, meaning their teachers knew that they were ditching class. The police and the Saints. So, like we saw, they were only stopped twice in 2 years. The police considered them to be good boys. leaders in the community. They weren't punished severely if they were caught doing something. And so generally, the police didn't see them to be a threat. The Roughnecks. The Roughnecks are the same age as the Saints. These are a mild-mannered group. They're not rowdy. They're not rich. They're not well-dressed. And probably because of that, they have a bad impression by the police and community. They do engage in some fighting, some theft, and some drinking. They also felt that the police harassed them for no reason as well. In school, the Roughnecks were not disruptive. They did not hang out in large groups. They did go to school, but they definitely didn't want to be there, which I'm sure many high school students can relate to. Visibility. The Roughnecks had no access to cars. They were often seen in public. They gathered in populated areas. Teachers and police were present. They weren't trying to hide from the police, hide from teachers. Their demeanor, the Saints themselves, they got out of trouble by apologizing, by probably acknowledging their behavior and saying that they're sorry and they'll never do it again. When Roughnecks were caught by the police or by another authority, they're often hostile. And when they did skip school, they were considered to be more detectable than the Saints when skipping school. And that might have something to do with the fact that they are not dressed as well and they're not driving as nice of cars. The community didn't pick up on the Saints' vandalism, on their drinking, on their pranks as often. The community saw the Saints as more respectable, high school athletes and involved students. Roughnecks were not considered important to the community. They were not very visible students in the high school, therefore they weren't visible within the community. So, adult careers of the Saints and the Roughnecks, community underestimated who would turn out good and bad. 7 out of the 8 Saints went to college, so one of them did not go to college. Out of the Roughnecks, 2 got full athletic scholarships. Unfortunately, one individual attempted suicide, but now both of them are respected and secure in their jobs. 2 of the boys from the Roughnecks never finished school. So reinforcement, the community saw the Roughnecks as trouble, and like I mentioned before, with the student being treated by his teacher as a troublemaker, that reinforced that behavior, so it became a self-fulfilling prophecy because often people internalize the way that they're treated by outsiders. Jack and Herb, the Roughnecks who received the scholarships, they kind of broke that trend. And so all of this is a result of the way that they were labeled. So the conclusion is that the labeling theory does exist. The Saints are wealthy, and because they're wealthy and that they're involved in high school, they're not seen as deviant by society. Those Roughnecks who are lower class were viewed as deviant by society. Okay, so based on what you saw from the Roughneck and Saints study, what can you conclude? Just take a minute here, pause the recording, and write down any thoughts or observations. Perhaps you've experienced this, perhaps you've been labeled, perhaps you've labeled other groups. So take a minute, write down a 3 to 5 sentence response on your conclusions. Okay, as we know, the conflict perspective is always examining the imbalance of power. So they point out, when looking at deviance, that people with power will protect their own interests and define deviance to suit their own needs. Some believe that keeping marijuana illegal is just serving the values and interests of those in power, and that being that cigarettes and alcohol are just as harmful or more harmful show that there is an inconsistency of societal values and the law. Also, these theorists will argue that the entire criminal justice systems treat suspects differently. This is known as differential justice. So on average, white offenders, even with prior arrests, will serve shorter sentences than African Americans and Latinos. Unequal treatment from a conflict perspective is just perpetuating the inequality for minorities in the United States. Okay, that is going to do it for section 2 for chapter 7, Deviance and Social Control. And you will pick up on slide 14 through the end of the chapter for section 3. Thank you.